Maarten Denoo is a Belgian academic who recently released a paper at the Free University of Brussels about loot boxes, an issue I'll probably return to quite a bit on this podcast, as I do believe that gambling systems in games is the largest social issue in gaming. Maarten also contributes to Gameable, an organization of academics, legal scholars, and psychologists who have banded together for research and policy on gamble play, which is a term that means the intersection of gambling systems and games, which Maarten will talk more about in this episode. Maarten's recent study seeks new definitions for gambling systems in games because the different fields of law, psychology, and game design are all looking for different things from that definition. And he can also give us a view from the front line on regulation, as Belgium was the first country to ban loot boxes. Enjoy. To start off with, Maarten, thanks so much for joining me.
Welcome. Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah.
Can you give us like an overview of the current research with regards to loot boxes and future gambling addiction? Like, are we what are the metrics there, and are we at a place where we can call that like a causal relationship?
Mm-hmm. So I'd say the predominant focus of this kind of research on gaming gambling is psychology oriented and more quantitative stuff like surveys and so on. That's one avenue. And then a second avenue would be more the game design focused ones. And there's this one specific trend in this research that's been very focused on identifying and distinguishing dark patterns in games. You see this being discussed also on a EU level with regard to consumer law, for instance, Epic Games being fined for the inclusion of dark patterns in their games.
I've seen lots of different stuff around, like, people who spend a lot of money on loot boxes having a higher prevalence of being problem gamblers 6 months later, including people who are under the age of 18. But what I'm hoping to get from you is like a zoomed out, like 360, like what does the entire field know about this?
In terms of loot box exposure, there's actually been consistently found a relationship between exposure or interaction with loot boxes and then the problem gambling, as you talked about. But most of this, and you also hinted at this, is on a correlational level, which basically means that at one specific point in time, a survey is taken. What you also hinted at is this 6-month interval, which is more of a longitudinal design where you can actually also establish causality. There's much fewer studies that have actually taken this route. Some have, for instance, found a gateway from, opening loot boxes to eventually also real gambling, as well as in the reverse from real gambling to loot boxes. And then the other have, for instance, found there's a variety of gambling-like mechanisms in games and outside of games. So not just loot boxes, but also skin betting, social casino games, and so on. And they actually didn't find that loot boxes, for instance, were strongly associated with higher problem gambling. So there's differences between these studies. And I think when you're trying to establish causality, next to this quantitative research being done, there's also need for more qualitative research on why people actually buy loot boxes, because we know very little about this, as well as how, for instance, gambling disorder may arise as a result of play or interaction with a game. Maybe some more specific accounts of harm, how it occurs in people. A new avenue of research that's being explored and that's like increasingly being done is also the use of just digital trace data. So basically using what data is collected by either the game company itself or via third-party platforms. Also, this is more, in a sense, objective data because it's not self-reported by players. But obviously, there's also drawbacks because you don't really know how the data itself is generated. So you use what you're given by Unity in this case.
Is that only specific games that offer that?
The specific study I have in mind was done in collaboration with Unity, but there's also games that have I'm sure you're familiar with the Pareto principle, for instance, where 20% of people, pay 80% of revenue. And within this, when you
The
look at
whale
this
principle.
aggregate, this, gigantic, exactly, the whales, is that 1% of players sometimes even paid like up to 38% of a game's revenue.
Wow.
And these games were mostly social casino games, if I remember correctly.
When you were trying to tackle the issue of the intertwined nature of gameplay systems and gamble play systems, and I think this was the first study that where I came across the term gamblification, which I love. And it's something I've been writing about for a long time, which is the blurred lines between these things. And in the study, you tried to kind of measure that complexity and nail down the features that constitute gambling within a video game. And you kind of depart from the established ways of defining it and try to come up with your own ways of defining it. So can you talk about what you settled on in terms of like what to look for in a game?
What I immediately noticed is before loot boxes, there were other manifestations of gambling design in games, but social casino games and loot boxes are the most well known probably. I saw that as I mentioned, the psychology and the quantitative oriented research was really focused on what feature is someone exposed to and what effect does this have in what particular condition. On the other hand, then of the scientific debates, you had a larger convergence dynamic of, whole industries, of gambling industries and gaming industries that sort of come together. And this study then tried to, find this middle ground between the two tendencies and really highlighting that to see or to identify gambling in games also means recognizing more than just the gambling components. So, gambling in and of itself is already 3 elements basically, because you have the stake, you have the chance that is involved, that is not under the player's influence, and then you have the rewards at the end. And all of this already has a lot of structural variation in how it may be implemented in a game or in the loot box specifically. There's also a difference in how gambling is implemented in these games, because chance is different in gamble play or in loot boxes, in social casino games, whatever, than it is in, for instance, an online casino, which is also regulated as such. Because in games, for instance, chance may be determined by pity timers too. And I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the term. You are. Okay.
Yeah, but we should explain. So these are timers that's like, after a certain number of failed rolls, the user will basically be thrown a bone. Like, here's something of value. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's still not entirely clear whether these pity timers, whether they actually, curb excessive spending by throwing players a bone, or whether they just increase spending because, if I'm unlucky after a first pool, but I know that in 9 pools at the most, I'll get my reward, and I might just do the 9 pools as well. So players also aren't dumb and will sort of try and determine where the threshold is, where like the cap is for a pity timer.
I think gamers are smart, as you say, and by and large, the human mind is not very intuitive when it comes to randomness. And there are lots of sort of mathematics problems that are built on probability that kind of illustrate how unintuitive probability can be, like the Monty Hall problem and things like that. Mm-hmm. So it's quite rare that players beat the house, isn't it?
It is, and I think in terms of games, you could even say that the house always wins because there's no loss on their part, even if a gamer gets the best possible reward, and there's never a loss on the developer itself or the game development company, and so they always win regardless. It just depends
some
ones
on whether and zeros just got duplicated, and
yeah. There's a research line that is trying to adapt existing gambling scales and measures for gambling disorder, for instance, and gambling cognition scales, specifically to video game players, because that's also a criticism that has been coined in loot box research, is that the scales that are used are developed for gambling, for specifically commercial or monetary gambling, and not for pseudo gambling in video games. And so there's this research line that's trying to see where the overlap is, but also where the differences are.
You're saying that even like when you apply a sort of gambling addiction framework to pseudo gambling within the gaming space, it's not quite accurate. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think, for instance, when you look, for instance, at gambling cognitions, like these maladaptive cognitions or beliefs that gamblers will convince themselves of, that maybe not apply to games. One example of this, for instance, could be there's the gambler's fallacy, and then that sort of means that as you are unlucky, or when you roll a die and you're unlucky, then your chance actually increases to be lucky the next roll.
Yeah, because you're due for a win.
Yeah. But what we've been discussing, like the pity timers, if there's like a gradual increase in your chance that you're working towards, actually winning, then there could actually be something legitimate in the game that works like this mechanically, rather than it being a miscognition or a malcognition. So that's one example of it, but the whole illusion of control is also another, because controlling games are basically all about control. So that's also one that's really been looked into, I know, from this research.
It's almost like every game has its own different kind of version of it. So it must be so hard to try and come up with a framework that applies to all of it.
To be honest, that was a problem when I started 4 years ago, or almost 4 years ago, and it still is a problem.
I want to talk a little bit about chance, because that it seems like the most self-explanatory, but there's different kinds of chance. Like, and I'm not just talking about the sort of pity rewards. I also kind of more so mean like there's, the digital random number generator, which we're all familiar with. And then there's a more like physical, tangible chance, which would be like Magic the Gathering, printing out a certain amount of cards. And then it kind of goes out to the market, and it's much harder for them to immediately change that number by entering it into a computer or something like that. And then on top of that, you've got like a more human decided chance, which is like, if we play Battleship or rock, paper, scissors, like I don't know what you're going to do, which from my perspective is random, but it's also kind of not random. Which all might kind of seem a little sort of like philosophical and academic, but, it does matter when we start to try to like regulate things. And, we have to ask ourselves these questions like, do we want our definitions of gambling that might accidentally sweep up things like Magic the Gathering? So I'm keen to get your opinion on that. Like, do you differentiate between these different types of randomness?
I do agree on the, the philosophical underpinnings of this discussion. It's the eternal black box. That's to begin with. How random rewards are determined within the context of loot boxes and so on. Chance is also an integral aspect of play, and chance also has positive experiences. There's serendipity in chance. Chance can level the playing fields. This is sometimes used as sort of a defense mechanisms, maybe by opponents of potential regulation, is to say, if you try and ban loot boxes, then you might as well try and ban virtual treasure crates in games, just without any monetary stake or anything. All of those things come in the crossfire. I think what's important in this conversation is the aspect of profiling. I think nothing can ever, no random outcome, or a pseudo random outcome, I should say, can ever be determined on the basis of a player's, behavioral data, by knowing what they do, that the outcome can also be determined by it. But if we say that there can be no duplicates, then inventory management or inventory variables should prevent you getting a duplicate of rewards. But I think strictly in terms of, seeing whether, for instance, players are more or less active, and when they're less active, then maybe give them a better reward when they open something.
I see.
That sort of profiling, I think, would also by the game industry itself be considered disadvantageous, data manipulation.
So it's kind of like the reading of player behavior and what's in a player's inventory and things like that. You're kind of saying that could be used as a tool for good or evil.
Yeah, because like I said, the opponents, for instance, would say, chance is everywhere. Chance is just an integral aspect of play, of life in general. I don't know if you have them in Australia, but you have these Kindersurprise eggs, they're like chocolate eggs, and there's a container in them.
No, I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. But
we've got a local industry body that, which I think this is something that was decided at a global level. Like let's compare loot boxes to Kinder Surprise. Because they use that line here too.
Yeah. And I think you know too that there's quite a lot of differences between those, because when I buy the egg and before I actually eat the egg, the contents of the egg itself won't change. With loot boxes, that may be the case. And I think as long as there's so much opacity and clarity as to how the outcome of these loot boxes are determined, then this discussion will still be relevant.
No, that's hitting the nail on the head right there, because they can change the results of the random number generator at a whim, and they can do it before the point of deciding what you get, and after the point. I mean, you can receive a reward and then it could be nerfed. Then the reward is almost by definition less valuable.
What I also noticed in games was that there's a lot of focus on let's say responsibilizing players or their parents, which is part of a self-regulatory approach, by informing players or by giving them tools to restrict their own play or to prevent in case disordered play comes up. But when you look at how marketplaces are designed, when you see there's different notifications going around and such, then it's difficult to entirely responsibilize players and to never question the potential of potentially irresponsible design. Maybe I think a second point is also, with the exception of very few games, you cannot cash out your rewards, which also means by a lot of legal definitions that it isn't gambling. But it is important to be mindful that engagement is more than just playing the game or even purchasing in a game in and of itself, because it also means, watching videos, watching live streams, maybe going to external websites, and maybe even selling your loot box rewards, which can also add a financial incentive to the opening of loot boxes in a game.
I've always sort of maintained that these things do have monetary value because we're willing to pay for them.
Exactly.
The most perfect example is on the Counter-Strike Steam store, where a marketplace kind of decides on the price of an item. I mean, the very nature of gambling is, and we've acknowledged this as a society, that there are people with a thing in their brain that make them more vulnerable to this. And, by that definition, they can't self-regulate. And they have the sort of, if they have the knowledge ahead of time, they can choose to opt out of that. So, I kind of have that myself, and I choose not to go play slot machines because I know that about myself. But when it comes to video games where it's intermeshed with the game itself, so the whole self-regulatory argument, is just inherently flawed.
What I've tended to notice is that, a lot of the proactivity, let's say, to convert players to paying players, this proactivity is sometimes somewhat missing when it comes to, identifying maybe potentially vulnerable players or curbing their spending.
All of a sudden, they're not very proactive.
Yeah. So I'd say more can be done in this regard too, because there's this reframing of whales as VIPs or whatever. And VIPs will be the ones that are actively sought out even by some companies to sort of, in let's say, corpo speak to maximize their lifetime value.
You kind of moved a bit more towards questions and this is a quote from the study. Is the player steered towards repeated expenditure? Is the player informed of their control or influence and how rewards are determined? Mm-hmm. Is the accumulation of random rewards an achievement in and of itself? So you believe that we need to kind of just move away from these established definitions of gambling and more towards things like this when it comes to policy frameworks?
The term gamble play is very holistic. So it takes all kinds of, it doesn't really concern itself whether something is gambling or gaming according to law. It just takes it all under one umbrella term. But this very provocative stance that doesn't concern itself with law is maybe also not always as usable to lawyers. But I think consumer law, for instance, may be something that is more or potentially more applicable to loot boxes than current gambling legislation is. So this moving away from gambling law is something you see in international discussions currently, because gambling law, as I said, is held back by the actual value or the worth, the monetary worth of the item not being there.
That's very interesting. So what does consumer law offer? Like, how do they tackle that from that perspective?
There's this one tool, for instance, which has been discussed in the context of loot boxes, which is the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which was a framework for EU policy. And this framework details that, in the context of loot boxes, it has been interpreted as that, loot boxes have to display real world costs. So they can use the virtual currencies, which basically almost every game has, but they also have to, not obfuscate the real costs of an item. They also have to display probabilities. And then there was this additional point, which also stated that there can be any exhortations to minors, for instance, like, buttons in a game that are maybe a little too aggressively commercial, like upgrade now, buy now. There's discussion on this too. But what this allows basically is to sort of pivot away from the gambling discussion and to have a broader consumer protective stance on loot boxes that is also applicable on an EU basis. So, because in Belgium, and Belgium was the first country to, effectively ban loot boxes. But in Belgium, the ban is applied on the basis of gambling law, and gambling law here is different than it is in the Netherlands. It's different than it is in France. And with consumer law, there's a little bit more cohesion between countries, I'd say. But Belgium was the first one to effectively take action and to ban loot boxes, which was quite a hard, restrictive stance, which, took them to the world news everywhere, I felt. Research conducted by Leon Xiao, by the way, has indicated that there's a lot of non-compliance, especially among mobile games in Belgium with the loot box ban. But it should also be clear that the loot box ban, as I said earlier, I believe, there's no such law. It's rather an interpretation of a 1999, if I'm correct, gaming law based on a report, I think, in which 4 games were played. I can't remember the names of the games. I think FIFA was one of them, Star Wars Battlefront 2. Because Battlefront 2 is basically the
pride and accomplishment.
Game that's that started it all. That's it for Belgium and for the Netherlands. They've also been, the Kansspelautoriteit, which is like the Dutch Game Commission, also finds Electronic Arts back in 2018, if I'm correct, if I'm remembering correctly. But very recently, and I think this was from 2022 or the year after, there's been a case where actually like the fining has been overthrown, specifically pertaining to FIFA. And in FIFA, the argument was made that loot boxes only constitute this smaller part within a game that in its entirety is more skill focused. And so as a whole, I'd say, it seems like FIFA in any case is in the clear in the Netherlands.
Okay.
One interpretation could be that if FIFA is cleared of loot boxes, then other games could be too.
Like there's the potential for a precedent there where so many games, the actual gambling part is a small part of the game. You could make a huge world the size of World of Warcraft, but then put one house in it that's literally a casino. And then by that argument, it's okay. Do you foresee a future where we can regulate these things based on like patterns of design and patterns of code?
For instance, if we're talking patterns, like these dark patterns that are adopted by legislators, by consumer law organizations, it's like trying to, a feature never exists in and of itself within a game. They're also integrated within other features, so they sort of interact with them. So you cannot, at the moment, I'd say you cannot really gauge the effects of this one specific feature, this one unethical feature that you want removed, because you would have to either do experiments or to really control for these other features. But that's one problem with it. And then the other problem is how do you actually, tackle this if this one feature, which is unethical, is shown to have this detrimental effect on players, then how do you remove it? Because removing it will also, maybe disrupt the balance in a game, the game economy. This is also what we saw in Belgium with regard to, Belgian players being disadvantaged on the let's say, international multiplayer system in some games because they couldn't buy loot boxes anymore. And so they had to maybe grind a little more to get their loot boxes, which is also not something you want. I know that there's, disgruntled players in Belgium too. For instance, there was this article in 2019, I remember, on a sporting website, which said that, esporters are disadvantaged currently because you'll see in FIFA, for instance, that there's these tourneys or tournaments that are sponsored and then you can participate as a player and there's big prizes to be won. But if you're Belgian and you can buy, your components for a better team, then you're at a significant disadvantage to actually be able to build this ultimate team and to participate in these tournaments. That would be one example. But even within just online player matches, that's also disadvantageous, where loot boxes afford mechanical advantages.
They really started promoting Ultimate Team, which was the, for those who don't know, there's the, normal FIFA play with, where you're in charge of the football team. And then there's Ultimate Team mode where all of your players were sort of unwrapped in card packs, and you pay for the card packs. And FIFA generally gets a pass when people talk about loot boxes. I think because of the presentation of the card pack is more like a Magic the Gathering type of thing, but it very much is a loot box.
And then one aspect of this law angle is that there's not a lot of compliance to begin with by developers, because if there's no enforcement by the Gaming Commission itself, then developers don't really have an incentive to comply with the legal provisions, and they won't be fined for it. On the contrary, like if they actually comply, they'll be at a disadvantage on the market compared to industry actors or their competitors who do not comply. That's one. But a second question should also be, so what if this ban is being enforced? And there was one study within Gameable where we looked at, circumvention practices done by adolescents in Belgium. So the people or the players we talked about that face this, this loot box ban, and it will then try and circumvent it in some ways. And now some of these ways are really laughably easy. Like sometimes for games it can be, maybe I shouldn't go too specific, but I'll just say it. Like, for instance, in Genshin Impact, it's as easy as changing your account location to a country other than Belgium.
Oh, wow. So you don't even have to like use a VPN or anything?
No. Okay. So there's no geo-block at all. So you don't have to use a VPN. VPN is another. You also have different external websites where you can purchase soft currencies, and then you can use these soft currencies in the game. And so there's different methods, but I think a more fundamental question here is basically, the players who are doing this, are they also the players that maybe need the ban the most, that are maybe the more vulnerable players? Because if a ban is really easy to circumvent, then if I am, for instance, a player who is like addicted to loot boxes, and I'm using my fingers to,
yeah.
But if I'm addicted to loot boxes and there's a ban that is easily circumventable, then this ban will not restrict my access to these loot boxes. And I think, with all talk about regulation and so on, this is an important one to consider. And this basically also goes not just for loot boxes or games in general, but just for digital media governance. If you know that something is potentially damaging to players, then also consider whether the solution to your problem is the end-all solution. And I wouldn't say that the ban on loot boxes was the end of loot boxes in Belgium. So,
yeah, that's a really good point. And it's so hard to do something like that when we're part of a global community and we're connected to a global internet.
I mean, we did some exploratory analysis to see what differentiates the people who circumvent the ban from the people who do not. The biggest predictor of, the circumventing behavior was the frequency with which they sold loot box rewards for real money. So that would basically mean that, if the results are accurate, that there is a financial incentive to opening loot boxes, and that if you take away, your ability to purchase loot boxes and to then sell them for a profit, then people or players might circumvent. That was the biggest one. Yeah.
Interesting. So, I mean, yeah, I guess that implies that they're very active members of that system. Yeah. And, being able to cash out is important to them. And when you combine that with the fact that the house always wins, it's pretty much gambling addiction.
I learned pretty quickly on in my research when I tried doing interviews with developers and, attended industry events, that they also don't want to be associated with gambling. It's sort of a discussion that they'd rather move on from, and also understandably in some case, because the whole gambling discussion is also lucrative, I feel, for some actors, not just in the games industry, but in news, in player communities and so on.
Yeah, no, I think there's a special place in hell for the YouTubers that, their whole channel is dedicated to like big reactions on getting the skins in Counter-Strike and stuff like that, making it seem like you always get the knife,
This ecosystem can be referred to, and then players are led to these sort of videos, because sometimes, loot box pack openings will be sponsored by the developer of the game itself, which I think is a questionable relationship.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for making the time to chat to me, Maarten. Really grateful.
Thank you so much.